Hello world, and welcome to the first episode of Oddit, a show where we discuss topics, ideas, and also the methods by which we come to understand those topics and ideas. So, what are the two kind of main methods we got going on there in the world of inquiry? Well, we've got philosophy and science, which are completely complementary, but oddly enough, as of late, there's been this spirit that science is this panacea, and philosophy is more on the woo side, which couldn't be further from the truth. First and foremost, philosophy, the formalized quest for understanding the world, is not woo, and science is basically just a really simple method that arose out of the ground that philosophy tilled. So, where do science and philosophy differ? Well, they answer different kinds of questions. Philosophy answers questions like, how do we come to know things? Philosophy deals with setting up the structure of sound arguments, so logic. And philosophy also can deal with aesthetics and a host of other issues that are more artistic. Now, science, as I've said, is just a method, and it's a specific method for deriving information about the material world. So with the scientific method, what you do is you do an experiment to test an idea or a hypothesis. If that experiment is repeatable and other people can set up that experiment and confirm your hypothesis by doing the same experiment over and over again, you establish a pattern. This is basically functioning on inductive reasoning, as in, this has occurred before, and since there's no reason for it not to occur again, therefore it's going to occur again, and it's a phenomenon in the world that functions along this pattern. And that's basically all that science can do. It can yield data about the physical world, which you can contextualize into a probabilistic predictive system. Now, philosophy gets in there, again, because once you have that data derived, well, you've got to go ahead and put it into a context, and the best and most accurate way of doing that is more of a philosophical question. As I've said, logic is kind of a domain of philosophy, and deduction, which is basically taking a premise and then deriving necessary conclusions from that premise, is what we use to do that when we compare and contrast systems. Deduction, unlike induction, doesn't really have to be true or correlate to anything directly observable. So let me give an example of a deductive argument or proof. All men are blue. Obviously that's not true, but if all men are blue and Bob is a man, then Bob is blue. It's a necessary conclusion based on the criteria that we have. So once we get, scientific findings like, okay, men have nipples. Well, Ted is a man, therefore Ted has nipples. Scientifically, that is true. Yeah. Although, of course, somebody could be born without nipples, but that's called a exception. Yeah, anomaly. Right. So, there we go. Now, why is philosophy important, and why is it important not to dissociate it? Well, because it keeps us humble and has also produced most of the advances that we see in terms of the way that society is structured. If you live in a Western democracy, that's thanks to Enlightenment thinking and people like John Locke. And furthermore, it kind of does away with some of the nihilism that, hey, the only things worth sussing out are the physically observable phenomenon that we get by doing science, and the world is all about building a better iPhone, which obviously that leads to a very shallow and nihilistic sort of thinking, and it also leads to thinking that we have things all figured out. Reductionism, which is kind of how science works and has merit as one method for getting at the truth, gets taken a little bit too far and a little bit too seriously. What reductionism is breaking things down into component parts in order to understand how they work. So you would take apart a car engine, the same kind of concept. But then you have to put the car engine in the context of the car to make it really make sense anyway. So you can't do one without then doing the other, which the other in the case of inquiry is philosophical, building things back up into a functioning framework. And, yeah, it's really important to keep these things in mind, because models are not reality. And when we substitute models for reality, well, we get a pretty shallow reality. And when we think we've arrived at the reality, as I've said, that leads to a whole host of psychological problems, which, if you've been paying attention recently, well, kind of going on out there. Some interesting things about philosophy and just the whole spirit behind it and how it can tie into the fractal concept that I have going on here with Oddit Oration, the Fractal Journal, is that in order to understand the world, even if you are looking through a scientific lens, you have to weed out your biases. The first lens that you look at things through is through the lens of the self. So the ancient Greek philosophers said, know thyself. And then later on, I think during the Renaissance, it was said, man is the measure of all things, which I disagree with that statement, because if he was, why would he need a compass? But nonetheless, everything passes through the filter of us. So we better make sure that that filter is squeaky clean and free of bias, which, science can give us the data that is not necessarily tainted by human bias, but then when we interpret that data, that's going to be tainted by that bias. So in order to get away from the biases that we can commit through looking at data and interpreting data, we need to have a good grounding in philosophy and logic. In fact, there's a whole list of common logical fallacies that are constantly repeated. They appeal to authority, motivation fallacy, etc. These are done both by the layman and by the scientist and philosopher himself. So basically, I think in part it has to do with our biology, because we're associative thinkers. Our memory functions by chunking together information. And, to give an example of how this applies to the fallacies, the authority fallacy means the guy in the lab coat probably has the right answer because he's got the lab coat and the education, and we're going to take his word for it. That's associative thinking, because you're associating, educational attainment and clothing with a certain competence, which may or may not be there. Anyway, thanks for stopping by today. I'll have more on the interesting things that neurology, psychology can bring to elucidating that first lens and helping us to do philosophy and science better by refining ourselves. Have a great time wherever time finds you, and goodbye.